Officially welcome everyone to Tagging Trash in the Toronto Harbour. It's great to have so many people joining us from all over. Tagging Trash was a really exciting and unique project that we launched this past summer as part of our larger Fighting Floatables work with Ports Toronto and Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. Its purpose was to help us uncover the fate and transport of plastic pollution by tracking the movements of GPS tagged bottles. And you'll learn a lot more about that today. We're really excited to share some preliminary results. And after some brief introductions, we'll explain what we plan to cover with you today. And before we continue, it's very important that we recognize the history of the lands we call home. And we are thrilled, as I've mentioned a few times, to have people joining us from many different locations and countries today. And we extend our acknowledgements to the Indigenous and traditional pasts across all territories. For our team at the University of Toronto, we will speak to the land on which we operate. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land and encourage you to have a look into your own traditional histories from where you are coming from today. So my name is Susan. I'm one of the co-founders of the University of Toronto Trash Team. And prior to being with this team, I worked with a program called the Great Canadian Shoreline Cleanup for more than a decade, helping volunteers who were interested in reducing litter to help lead shoreline cleanups across the country. And I'm joined by our incredible lineup of speakers today, Dr. Chelsea Rochman, Cassandra Sherlock, and Patricia Semcesen. Chelsea is another founder of the Uft Trash Team. She's an assistant professor of ecology and program lead of scientific programming and application for the Uft Trash Team. She's going to wrap up today's webinar with a look at our solutions-based research programs in the Toronto Harbour. Cassandra, or Cassie, is a master's student at the University of Waterloo. She was formerly our team's community outreach and research specialist, and she led the field season for Tagging Trash, which included deployment of our bottles, and she's going to share a lot more about what that involved. And then Patricia, or Pat, is an environmental science PhD student at the University of Toronto Scarborough campus, and she's been working with the data, doing a lot of interesting modeling for the GPS tag bottles, and is going to be sharing some of those preliminary results with us today. And just before we get into that, I want to thank everyone that made this possible. It was made possible with the support of our collaborators and supporters, and we're so thankful. It was created in collaboration with Ports Toronto, the University of Toronto Scarborough, Toronto and Region Conservation Authority, and the Ontario Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks. And we also received support from Environment and Climate Change Canada, as well as the National Geographic Society. And I know we're all really excited to learn about tagging trash, but just to give a bit more context about who the Uft Trash Team is, we are a science-based outreach group made up of volunteers, students, and earlier career researchers. And we're all working towards this shared goal to increase waste literacy in the community while reducing plastic pollution in our ecosystems. We formed in 2017, so still relatively new. And that was in collaboration with the Rochman Lab, part of the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Toronto. We do three main types of work towards positive change. We have community outreach programs such as cleanups. We have education, which includes a grade 5 classroom visits with some waste literacy lesson plans, and our solutions-based research, which includes our CBIN work in the local harbor with Ports Toronto, just to name a few. And if you're a more visual learner like me, you might appreciate our very brand new, hot off the press theory of change that we worked on together. And it was designed and illustrated by one of our volunteers and researchers, Madeline Milne. You can see here how science is at the core of our work. As you know, our roots go back to working with the Rochman Lab. And we take a watershed approach. So you can see all the way our different ways that we work connect in like a watershed to help our work locally connect together to build capacity globally. So now on to today. We're going to be covering all of these things in the time we have. By the end of today's webinar, you'll have more knowledge about our Fighting Floatables program on Toronto's waterfront. You'll of course learn more about the Tagging Trash project and hear results, and be able to meet everyone here and network with others interested in the issue. And we will start with an introduction to Tagging Trash from Cassie, followed by some preliminary results from Pat, and then Chelsea is going to tie it all together with an overview of our Fighting Floatables work before we get into a Q&A. And I'm going to go over these during the Q&A, but just quickly to let you know that you'll have an option to ask questions out loud, and also in the chat we'll go back and forth. as the presentations are happening, of course, if you have a question, you can type it in the chat. And if we're able to answer right away, we'll just respond to you in the chat. Otherwise, we'll then save those questions and get back to them during the Q&A at the end. Again, I'll show you how all of this works when it's time for that. And before we turn it over to our first speaker, I wanted to play a little bit first, and I will go on to actually share this website in a second. This is a very, very sneak peek at a brand new modeling tool. It was created by a PhD student at the Rochester Institute of Technology, Juliette Daly. She is part of a team led by Matthew Hoffman. They also study plastic pollution in the Great Lakes and develop mathematical models to predict how it might behave. So it's very, very relevant. And this tool is still in development, but you will be seeing in a second how it's very fun to play with, to visualize some data. So let me go to that now. And let's see. Okay, so let's just make sure that it's showing up properly for everyone. Okay, so what you can see here is that you can select different seasons. So we have Lake Ontario here, and what it's going to show us is if we have plastic, what's going to happen over about a month of time. So it's based on their data right now. We're going to choose summer because that's when the majority of our field season was. But let's just use the chat. I'm going to plunk something in Toronto, and just if you want to, before I do that, maybe type in your chat where you think it might start to travel to. So I'm going to put something right around here. I don't know if you can see the arrow, but just almost where it says Toronto, Canada. Okay, so we have some guesses that it's going to travel over here to Buffalo. And we've got some guesses about heading towards Rochester. Interesting. Okay, yes. Oh, okay, we have going over here. Excellent. And now, as I'm talking about this, it's interesting to note about the seasons and that there'll be different impacts about weather, so that might also change the results. So I think we've got counterclockwise around the lake. Okay, let's just see what happens with this. And remember, this is early stages and in development, but I encourage everyone to visit this website. Let's put a different one in. As I said, it was working this morning and now it's just staying put. So I'm going to refresh my screen and see if that fixes that. Okay, let's try this again. There we go. So this, in this case where I plunked it, it started going along the eastern shoreline. So we'll share the chat in the chat, the link to this website. You're welcome to play around with this, play around with the seasons. But I'd like to turn it over to welcome and introduce Cassie to share a little bit more about our work, and then keep this in mind when Pat shares to see how this compares to what we found.
Awesome. Thanks, Susan. Okay. Can everyone see my screen? Yes. Okay, fantastic. So hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm extremely excited to introduce the Tagging Trash project, which is one of the Trash Team solutions-based research projects that aims to better inform potential solutions of litter and tackle our local plastic pollution issue through different avenues of research, spanning from technologies, modeling, and citizen science data. So to begin, sorry about that. Our Great Lakes, like all bodies of water across the world, are faced with a major anthropogenic pollutant, plastics. We use it in our everyday lives, and because of this, its utilities and convenience of the convenience of plastics are pervasive, cycling in our water cycle, global dust cycles, and arguably is part of our carbon cycle. Researchers have estimated that in our Great Lakes alone, 10,000 tons of plastic enters them annually. So to give you context, that's about the weight of the CN Tower. The consequences of plastic pollution are grave. Plastic chokes, entangles, and smothers wildlife, many of which have actually been recorded in our Great Lakes. Recently, Keenan Minot, a researcher from the Rochman lab, published a paper indicating that fish in Lake Ontario have been shown to ingest an average of 59 pieces of microplastic, and the highest amount found in a single fish was 915 pieces. This is an alarming amount, and scientists have warned us of the many negative effects of plastics and what they have on our wildlife, like reducing reproduction rate, survival rate, and causing starvation. Studies have also shown that plastics are now in our drinking water, but the long-term effects remain to be unknown. So specifically here in the Toronto Harbour, our slips and beaches along the island and the Toronto waterfront are constantly polluted with plastic items. Some common items we, the trash team, have identified through our Semcesen characterization and our visual audits are small plastic fragments, film, bottle caps, doggy bags, cigarette butts, food wrappers, and pre-production pellets. So as we can see, sources of plastic may be spanning from plastics that we use day to day, but also from spillage, mainly from plastic industries. And actually from our visual audits alone, we were able to characterize over 100 different categories of plastic items. So I've actually included some videos of the Peter Basin slip, which I visited to retrieve one of our GPS tracked bottles. And for those of you who don't know, we actually have some map turtles that frequent the basin each August. So the video on the left here, should be playing, are what we hope that these map turtles would be swimming and thriving in. But unfortunately, the reality is the video on the right. And you can see one of our taking trash bottles has ended up with thousands of pieces of trash in that basin. And just amongst it is one baby map turtle, which I was following, is swimming and trudging through our garbage that has ended up here. So unfortunately, the Toronto Harbour, like all urban water bodies, has high plastic contamination, which we've just seen. The potential sources of which include storm drains, wastewater treatment plants, poor waste infrastructure, such as overflowing garbage cans, and unfortunately, just due to littering in general. For Toronto specifically, a huge potential source of litter may be the Don River, where the trash team actually quantified and characterized debris pulled from the booms that are installed there and found over 1,400 pieces of litter in just 90 minutes. So based on that cleanup alone, the trash team estimated that 650 kilograms of plastic litter enter Lake Ontario from the Don River annually. So here's our team here after a hard days of work. So although we can identify and speculate some sources of litter, once they enter the water, we have little knowledge on where they go and where they end up. Do they stay within the region that they're released? Do plastics travel far enough throughout Lake Ontario, polluting other major cities that we share a lake with? Or do they just stay put? This issue came up while co-founders of the trash team were in a board meeting with some sustainability team members at Ports Toronto while discussing where they should place trash capture devices like a seep bin to effectively and efficiently remove litter from the Toronto Harbour. It was then when someone said, "I wish we could just throw a plastic ball and track where it goes." So this idea has actually been done about a handful of times in different water bodies and countries such as Korea, India, Australia, and the US. But we still have little to no knowledge regarding plastic transport in our Great Lakes and in our water bodies in general. So Blossom the Tagging Trash Project, in collaboration with Ports Toronto, TRCA, MECP, and Uft Scarborough, we launched this initiative. Through this investigation, we aim to reveal the litter in Toronto Harbour, or the pathways of litter in the Toronto Harbour, to better understand local sources of litter and help inform how to tackle our plastic pollution issue. We plan to better understand its pathways and transports by releasing GPS tracked bottles into the harbour so we could better understand how litter travels in and around the harbour. The data would then be collected and utilized to develop a hydrodynamic model, which is being led by PhD student Patricia, and she'll discuss her work thus far in a bit. And this will help inform our future placement of trash capture devices such as seep bins to divert litter from Lake Ontario. So how did we do this? We used plastic water bottles, specifically the blender bottle, as a model for plastic pollution. And inside each bottle, we placed a GPS tracker, which we purchased from Globalstar. So we were able to manually program how often we wanted the trackers to report their locations. And we programmed them to report about each hour, where the data would come through onto a portal and show us its latitudinal and longitudinal coordinates. The data allows us to see all the trajectories throughout the 4 months, where Pat would be able to analyze the data and develop the model. So you can see here, we have our tracker inside the bottle. And so the timeline of this project was about 4 months. We started out in April, where we conducted a trial with a few bottles from 6 different locations along the waterfront in the harbor. You can see it was still a bit chilly in April, where co-founder Rafaela is here about to throw a bottle from Humber River. And from this trial, we were able to determine how difficult it was for TRCA and the trash team to retrieve the bottles and how effective our bottle design was. So from there, we did our first deployment in the last week of April in order to catch the entire seasonality of May, which we predicted to be quite interesting in activity. And at the end of May, we collected all the bottles. TRCA were crucial and amazing collaborators in collecting all the bottles at the end of each month so that we, the trash team, could then replace the batteries of the GPS trackers for the next following deployment. In May, we also modified the bottle design to have plasticine at the bottom. And this would ensure that the bottles sit in a certain orientation when floating in the water to obtain the best GPS coordinates as possible. We then redeployed another set of bottles at the beginning of June and also put up some posters across the waterfront in the city to better inform our community of this project. The bottles were then retrieved again at the end of June, and in July, we redeployed another batch and then collected again at the end of the month, and then redeployed for the last time in August, where we actually modified the tracking time to about 30 minutes instead of an hour and only left them in for 2 weeks instead of 4. So you can see some pictures of our team setting up these bottles and myself during a deployment. So this project allowed us to engage many of our volunteers as we had some deploying bottles across the waterfront and retrieving them. In the first photo here, you can see Haley and Rachel at Marina Key West about to throw a bottle in. And Haley is actually holding one of our posters, which we had created to better inform our community of the project and learn more about our local plastic pollution issue. In the second photo, we have Emily and her dog Jane assisting us in deploying the bottles across the harbor in her little dinghy. And lastly, we have Ariba, who's about to deploy a bottle from Center Island. Deploying and retrieving were great opportunities for the local community to come and ask us questions about the projects, its objectives and goals, and many of which were just pleased to find out that we weren't littering just for fun. And lastly, we are very excited to see that our project has already been inspiring similar initiatives locally and globally, where researcher Dr. Marcus Brinkham from the University of Saskatchewan is actually conducting a similar study in the South Saskatchewan River. We have also consulted and advised with a researcher in Vietnam who plans to conduct a similar study in the Red River, which is known to be a huge potential source of plastics to our oceans. So to finish off, this study has been extremely innovative and exciting, and based on where we're seeing the bottles accumulate and move, will not only help us to determine where we need to place trash capture devices, but also inform the type of device needed depending on the accumulation zone. So I want to thank you all very, very much for coming, and feel free to email me regarding any questions that aren't answered today, or follow me on Twitter.
Thanks so much, Cassie. And if you have more questions for Cassie, we will have Q&A towards the end, so you can think about all of your questions about what it took to think up what we did in the harbor with these bottles. I will now turn it over to Pat to share her presentation to show what we found out once those bottles were in the harbor.
Thanks for that. Yep, so I'm just going to share my presentation. All right. So yes, thank you for that introduction, Susan. I'm a PhD student at the University of Toronto, and through this project, I want to help answer key questions about plastic pollution. Specifically, what are the sources of plastic pollution in and around the Greater Toronto Area? Where does it go? How far does it travel? And what can be done to reduce plastic pollution? So let's dive into the data from this research project to begin answering some of these questions. So how far do they travel? As Cassie had mentioned earlier, we released these GPS tracked plastic bottles in and around Toronto Harbour to collect information to diagnose the problem of plastic pollution in Toronto Harbour so we can understand how to treat it. We observed 3 main patterns of our tracker travel in Toronto Harbour. The first, some tracker bottles remained very close to their deployment location, and we call these couch potatoes. Because they don't travel much. The second are the trendy trackers. These are they set the trend because most of the trackers have actually traveled across Toronto Harbour, but quickly became stuck or stranded in or near Toronto Harbour, so they didn't really travel very far. And lastly, there are the very few trackers that traveled across Lake Ontario, one of which actually made it to USA waters, and these are the escape artists. So now to understand how far these GPS trackers traveled, I'll begin by explaining net displacement. And the distance our GPS trackers traveled can be described in terms of net displacement. It's a simplified way of looking at the data, but with this preliminary data, it's still useful. So on this map in the light red color is the raw data that shows the path of this one tracker and how it moved in the harbor. But to simplify it, we're going to talk about net displacement. So the net displacement is the distance from the initial tracker position to the distance to the final tracker position. So that's net displacement. So to keep this preliminary data simple, I will use net displacements of our trackers instead of the actual paths of trackers to explain the travel pathways of all our trackers. And the tracker shown on this map has a net displacement of about 4 kilometers, but let's now have a look at the net displacements of the other trackers. So looking at this image, it looks like a bit of a mess. There are a lot of trackers here, but I'll pick it apart for you soon. So first, I'll show you this pie chart on the right here. It helps to summarize and visualize the proportion of GPS trackers that traveled different distances. So in blue, we have the couch potatoes that hardly travel. And they only traveled about 100 meters from where they were deployed, and they account for 6% of trackers. So to give an idea of what 100 meters looks like, some of you, if you have a very strong throwing arm, might be actually able to throw like a ball 100 meters. So this gives an idea of how far they actually traveled. It's not very far, especially when we consider that Toronto Harbour is about 2 or 3 kilometers long, depending on which dimension you're looking at. But back to the data. In green, about 36% of the trackers traveled shorter distances, and they stayed mostly within the harbor, and also the yellow. So the green and the yellow, they are the trendy trackers. They have very similar trends of travel, and when combined, they actually account for 79% of all trackers. This is a large proportion. So trackers traveling up to 1 kilometer in green tend to stay in the harbor, while those traveling between 1 and 5 kilometers in yellow are slightly more likely to leave Toronto Harbour, but they don't really travel far outside of it. And finally, there are the escape artists that travel upwards of 10 kilometers from Toronto Harbour in orange and red. So when combined, the escape artists account for 15% of trackers that we released. And to understand where these GPS trackers traveled and why, and why they accumulated where they did, I need to talk about the weather and specifically wind velocity. So winds have a strong influence on our floating GPS tracked bottles because the part of the bottle that is above water acts as a sail that catches the wind. So with this in mind, we are now able to look at the observed winds in Toronto Harbour and make inferences between the observed winds and the destinations of our trackers. So the transport of our GPS tracker bottles and other floating plastic debris depends on wind speed and direction. So this image here on the left shows a wind rose, and a wind rose basically shows wind velocity like a compass shows direction. So northerly winds blow from the north, easterly winds blow from the east, southerly winds blow from the south, and westerly winds blow from the west. So the size of each of these bars on the wind rose indicates more wind coming from that direction. So here we see longer bars coming from the west-southwest, and so this indicates a lot of the wind comes from these directions. Meanwhile, the color corresponds to wind speed, where blues indicate slower speeds and reds indicate faster speeds. So in Toronto Harbour, most of the winds blow in from the west-southwest. These are the prevailing winds. And there are occasional storms that bring in fairly strong winds from the north, east, and the south. And during the summer of 2021, the weather was actually quite a bit stormier than usual. And these storms brought in fairly frequent and strong winds from the north, but especially from the east and the south directions. So now that you know a bit more about the winds and how they affect the transport of our tracker bottles, I can start to highlight some of the observed transport patterns. Getting back to our map, showing the net displacement of our trackers, I can use the observed winds to determine some travel patterns. And I'll start talking about the prevailing winds coming from the west. So on the map, I'm only showing the subset of trackers that demonstrate the effect of prevailing westerly winds. Now, this is a simplification of their travel paths, but these were predominantly affected by the westerly winds. So these prevailing winds help contain Toronto's floating plastic pollution by blowing it eastward. And we saw a lot of our trackers accumulating in the shipping channel, and a couple of our trackers seem to have actually been destroyed when they entered the shipping channel. We suspect that they were broken by propellers of large ships that turn around in turning basin here. And this fragmentation of plastic debris can actually expedite the formation of microplastic pollution. So this is an interesting result of our research in Toronto Harbour. So the presence of plastic debris where ships can break it apart with propellers can actually expedite the formation of microplastic pollution. So it'd be good to install trash capture devices in areas like this, just to prevent it from being destroyed by boats or fragmented by boats. Farther north, we saw some of our trackers heading upstream in the Keating Channel, which was a bit surprising because the Don River flows south generally. And so seeing our tracker bottles traveling north, so upstream of the water, we were a little bit surprised. But what we noticed actually was the winds were strong enough to blow our trackers upstream. So the wind was strong enough to overcome the water currents. And this is actually a high traffic area in the Keating Channel for plastic debris. So this would also be a prime location for installing a trash capture device. While a few trackers did manage to leave the inner harbor through the East Gap, they did become trapped in and around Cherry Beach and Tommy Thompson Park. So they didn't really leave out of the East Gap into Greater Lake Ontario. So conversely, talking about easterly winds coming from the east, we can infer that the floating debris entering Toronto Harbour will mostly remain contained because it gets caught on Centre Island. But about a third of our plastic bottles, of our tracker bottles that were influenced by easterly winds, did actually manage to squeeze out of the Western Gap. And while they did squeeze through this gap, they actually ended up beaching mostly around Ontario Place and along the shores of Etobicoke. So in order to deal with this issue of a lot of plastic going through the West Gap, it'd be good to have also a trash capture device here. So both the easterly and the prevailing westerly winds dominated the movement of trackers within Toronto Harbour, but we still have northerly and southerly winds. Here, northerly winds can promote the escape of plastic debris if that plastic debris makes it out into outer Toronto Harbour. Otherwise, the docks and small channels in Centre Island capture the plastic debris that is traveling southward. So finally, the southerly winds help keep our tracker bottles within Toronto Harbour, and they would also then presumably help contain floating plastic debris within the slips and channels, while the docks and boardwalks actually trapped our tracker bottles. And so we found a need to place other trash capture devices here because we saw a lot of accumulation of our tracker bottles and of other plastic debris. So looking back at the initial deployment locations and final locations in Toronto Harbour, we can see that some of these net displacement paths leave our view. So most of these trackers had actually traveled across Toronto Harbour within 1 or 2 days before becoming stranded, and that was the end of their trip. But there were a few tracker bottles that did manage to escape. And let's step back to get a better view of where they went. So we are now 10 times farther away, and we can see a few tracker bottles. Some are in Etobicoke, not quite in Mississauga, and there's another one in Ajax. But there are a couple more that we still can't see. So let's step back a bit farther. And now we are 100 times farther away. We can see Lake Ontario, we can see Lake Erie, Lake Huron, and the Atlantic Ocean. So looking from this perspective, we can see that Toronto's plastic pollution is not a localized problem. Toronto's plastic pollution can travel throughout Lake Ontario. And this preliminary information that I presented to you today gives us useful information about some fates of floating plastic debris in Toronto Harbour, and discussing the net displacement gives us a picture of where to begin to work to mitigate plastic entry and address areas of plastic accumulation. So the analysis of this data is a work in progress. The work is ongoing, and I'm currently analyzing the transport paths of each of these GPS trackers. So this is an image of 3 examples of our long distance, our escape artists, some of our escape artists. And I'm going to take a closer look at this picture. So looking closer at these 3 trackers that managed to escape into Lake Ontario, we can see some of the variability in travel paths. These are caused by variations in winds, water currents, and also the effect of Coriolis forces, but I won't get into that today. And so we see that there is quite a bit of variability in the paths they can take. Sometimes they are very direct and straight. It's just very linear, much like the net displacement I was talking about earlier, but others are very curly and convoluted, such as the one that landed in Ajax. So to summarize, 6% of the GPS tracker bottles traveled within 100 meters of their deployment positions, which suggests that slips and channels with docks or boardwalks help really retain local plastic pollution, which is a good thing. It makes, if we don't have to chase after our pollution to clean it up. But 79% of our trackers traveled through the harbour in just 1 or 2 days, then became stranded within or just outside Toronto's inner harbour. So this is Toronto's inner harbour, this is Toronto's outer harbour. Most of them stayed within or just outside of Toronto's inner harbour. And the prevailing westerly winds help contain Toronto's floating plastic pollution. The easterly winds mostly help to retain pollution, but the easterly winds did encourage plastic to leave through the West Gap. Northerly and southerly winds play a relatively small role in plastic debris transport, but both can help maneuver plastic debris out of the outer harbour or the West Gap. So we saw a lot of our trackers accumulating in the shipping channel. Some of these were destroyed, possibly by ships, which could create more small pieces of plastic that are much more difficult to collect. So a trash capture device should be placed at the mouth of the shipping channel. Also, there should be a trash capture device at the mouth of the Keating channel, because this is also a high plastic debris traffic area. And it would also be beneficial to have a trash capture device near the Bathurst Quay and Billy Bishop Airport at the West Gap, since approximately 14 to 15% of all trackers actually traveled through this gap. Even if the plastics, our tracker bottles didn't travel very far, they still managed to get through. And once they get outside of Toronto's inner harbour, they can escape out into Lake Ontario. So the next steps for this project are to determine the relationships between tracker paths, wind velocities, and water currents. And this will help predict the effect of wind versus water currents on the transport of floating debris. So I will be creating a hydrodynamic model to investigate the sources, transport, and fate of plastic pollution in Toronto Harbour using Mic 3, which is a type of modeling software. So yeah, that wraps up my presentation, and I'm going to pass it on to Chelsea.
Thank you so much, Pat. There's already been some questions that we will get to, but I encourage you to kind of scroll up in the chat to prepare yourself for when we get to that section, because some of them are for you. But so we have time for that. I'll turn it right over to Chelsea, because I'm sure one of the questions everyone is wondering is now, what does this all mean, and what are we doing, and what can we do?
Wonderful. Thank you, Susan. Can you see my screen okay?
Yeah, looks great.
Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for attending. It's really fun to watch the questions pop up in the chat. So I'm excited to get to the Q&A and have a discussion. I'm just going to take a quick moment just to zoom out a little bit and sort of talk about some of the broader projects that the Tagging Trash project is related to, and put some of our results and plans into a broader context. So the Tagging Trash project, as Susan mentioned, is part of the solutions-based research program, where we aim to inform data-driven approaches to ultimately reduce plastic pollution. So within this program, we have sort of 3 different themes. One is our home waste audit, which is an annual community science and educational program. This program is run as a 1-month event where we ask people to audit their own waste at home and learn more about their waste management locally. Through our results webinar, after the audit, participants learn about the diversity of waste streams around the world and share insights about our waste generation and reduction. Our next one will be January 18th, I believe we will start. We'll start advertising soon, so please, you're all welcome to join. It's a lot of fun. Next, we have our pollution prevention projects. These spawn from data from our research in my lab or in with the Uft Trash Team. Right now, we're working on increasing our understanding of microfibers. We find an awful lot of them in our samples within the lakes. Also working on pre-production pellets. As Cassie mentioned, we find a lot of them in our sea bins. Right now, we're working on construction foam. We find a lot of foam in the harbor, and it does not seem to all come from single-use foodware. And Rafaela is leading a project on single-use foodware, actually, trying to look at how restaurants can maybe improve their programs so that we can have more reusable programs in the city. And finally, we have our Fighting Floatables project in the Toronto waterfront, which I'll discuss in more detail. And this also falls along with our International Trash Trap Network, which was inspired by our local work. And you can find all of these projects on our website. But what I really want to focus on today is our Fighting Floatables project, which includes 3 main projects centered around plastic pollution that directly align with the Floatables strategy, which is a strategy implemented by the Toronto Region Conservation Authority, or TRCA, in close collaboration with Swim Drink Fish, with ourselves, as well as with Ports Toronto, and funded by the local government, the Ontario Ministry of Environment, Climate, or Conservation and Parks. Sorry, the name changes every once in a while. Big acronym. So what I'll do today is sort of talk about the different work streams that we do within these projects. We collaborate closely with TRCA and Ports Toronto, as well as Ontario Ministry of the Environment, and we've been supported by Environment Climate Change Canada, as well as National Geographic, in addition to supported by our partners. So for Tagging Trash, as you heard, we also collaborate with colleagues at UTSC. But what I want to focus on today are the results from the other projects, because you've already heard lots about tagging trash. So these are our visual audits, which we call tracking trash, our Seabin project, which we call trapping trash, and then you've learned all about tagging trash. So we really try to stump you with our tongue twisters. So the purpose of our visual audit, which was a bit of a simpler way to be able to understand where litter accumulates around the harbor to inform the types of trash traps we might need to divert litter from the harbor, and also to inform where to put them. We wanted sort of a more simple protocol that could be used widely around the world. And so this involved a standard protocol for just walking along the location and visually quantifying and characterizing the waste that you see, to basically produce data like this that shows you locations, which would be great for bins. You can see here Peter Basin, where Cassie showed that picture and video of the turtle, where we will have a trash trap next year. I believe 2, actually. Within our trapping trash program, which is where we actually put the traps in place, this year, this is just some results from our Seabin program. This year, we had 3 Seabins at the Outer Harbour Marina, 2 on the island, and a few that were along the Toronto waterfront. These are owned and operated by Ports Toronto, as well as TRCA. And our role here is to create standard protocols to quantify and characterize the debris, to actually do the quantification and characterization of the debris locally to inform solutions, and then to run community education and outreach programs about them. So here you can see some of what we collect, which can directly inform some of our other pollution prevention problems. And one of the things we find super interesting is that we are not just capturing large plastic, but we are capturing a lot of that microplastic, including small bits of pre-production pellets and other broken down fragments. And I am not going to say anything more about tagging trash because it needs no further explanation. But what I really want to share with you today is the value of all of this work to our community, as well as some of our next steps. So far, our work has motivated trash traps locally and informed locations where they are most needed. Over the years, we are slowly acquiring more and more traps for the locations with the most litter. Next, we are expanding our trash trapping program beyond our community, and our broader goal is to motivate local solutions to global issues beyond Toronto. So for this, we've created the International Trash Trap Network, which you're welcome to go check out our website and learn what that is. But basically, it's a global network of people who are trapping trash through many different types of devices, using data to both measure their own local footprint, but also to feed into the International Coastal Cleanup Database, which is run by the Ocean Conservancy. So this is a close collaboration with Ocean Conservancy and the Uft Trash Team. Finally, our work is directly informing policy. So based on what we find in the harbor, we use that information to inform policies upstream. We fully understand that cleanup is not the only solution, and hopefully one day we no longer need it. But for now, we feel we do need it, and it really allows us to understand the sources as well as communicate and conduct outreach to the public. So some of the policies our work is directly informing, one is around pellets. We find a lot of these pre-production pellets in our samples. We are in direct conversations right now with the Canadian Industry, the Chemical Industry Association of Canada, CIAC, as well as the Ministry of the Environment to create a regulation for no pellet loss in the province of Ontario, and then working to think about how we can expand that federally. For foam, we are working with the Ministry of the Environment to figure out what % of foam that we see on the harbor is from construction, and working with government to think about how do you mitigate that. It's a little tricky. Third, we've been working really closely with Georgian Bay Forever and the Ocean Conservancy to understand how well filters work on washing machines to keep those microfibers out of the environment. With Georgian Bay Forever, we put filters in 97 homes in the town of Parry Sound and saw a significant reduction at the wastewater treatment plant scale. This work is being used to inform legislation in Ontario, in France, in the United States, as well as in Australia. And then the single-use plastics policy, I mentioned the work Rafaela is leading, and that's trying to see what are the barriers and benefits to reusables programs in our local restaurants, and can we use that to move from a voluntary program to a more mandatory program. And finally, what are our next steps? So we are currently working on a design challenge with the engineering students at the University of Toronto to design traps that fit to the type of debris we're seeing in the locations that we need them. We're looking forward to Tagging Trash 2.0, which is in collaboration with some people on this call. We're hoping to throw in the Don River, but also in the Chicago River, as well as in the Ipswich in New Hampshire and other places. We are open. Please reach out to us in Ocean Conservancy for how we might expand such a program. And then 3, we are interested in more trash traps and more data so that we can inform solutions globally and divert litter from our ocean. And finally, I just want to say we're really excited about some of this future work. We're proud of what our team has accomplished, but we could have no way done that without all of our partners and our supporters. So thank you. And thank you all for attending. And I look forward to discussion.
Great. So I'm just going to put the slide back up here so everyone can see how the Q&A is going to work. And just want to confirm, is the slideshow showing up for everyone?
Not yet.
Yeah, it's showing? Okay. So
no, not yet. Not yet. Sorry.
Not yet. Okay. There we go. That should be showing for everyone. So just a reminder for how the Q&A will work is we'll go back and forth between those who would like to ask a question out loud. If you want to ask a question out loud, what you'll do is if you go to the reactions section, you can see a raise your hand feature. And that's how we'll know that you want to ask a question. We'll let you know it's your turn, and then we'll take you off mute. And then if you had a question in the chat, just continue what you've already been doing. And we're getting tight on time because this is so much great information and I'm talking way too much. Let's just go first with some chat questions because there were some already happening, and I'll turn, Raphael has been keeping track of those questions. So Raphael, if you'd like to share the first question with us for our speakers.
Sure. Thank you, Susan. We have great questions here. The first one is from Chris Sasaki, and he asked, are different types of plastic debris affected differently by wind? Depend on shape, buoyancy, how much is above water, etc. So this is for Pat.
Yeah. So, okay, good. I'm unmuted. Yes. So definitely different types of plastic, different shapes, buoyancies, they all have an influence on how they're transported. So a plastic debris that's completely submerged in the water would then be transported more by the water currents because the wind doesn't actually catch any of the plastic like a sail. So knowing how much plastic actually sticks out of the water versus is in the water can make that transport different. For this research, I helped design the bottles so that they would all have the same buoyancy. That's the great thing about using plasticine was we were able to modify the weight and therefore just maintain equal buoyancy, just so we're working with the same type of data throughout all deployments. But yes, if we had denser bottles, then they would be deeper in the water and there would be less plastic or even no plastic sticking out of the water, so that whatever's sticking out of the water would catch the wind. But if it's deep enough, then it won't catch the wind and it would be then entirely dependent on the water currents. But also the depth at which they are in the water currents are different. So water currents tend to travel faster near the surface just because the wind is actually causing the water currents to move faster. So we'd expect, more buoyant plastics to move faster because they're just in that faster moving water, and deeper plastics to not really move as quickly because those deeper water currents move slowly.
Okay, I have two questions for you. One is from Rochelle. She asked, since trash from Toronto can end up quite far away from Toronto, is it okay to assume that waste from other places can end up in Toronto? And is there any way to estimate how much trash is local and how much is escape artists from other places?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. Trash from other places can actually come into Toronto. Looking at our results, we did deploy some of our plastic debris from just outside Toronto's inner harbour, so in Toronto's outer harbour. And generally, we saw it kind of just blowing into Toronto or getting blown right out into Lake Ontario, depending on the winds. So we can see the possibility, the likely possibility that trash from other places in Lake Ontario or even the other Great Lakes that are upstream of Lake Ontario, we can expect to have that trash coming in. Unfortunately, we didn't have a very large scale project. It was just within and around Toronto Harbour. So I can't say for sure how much plastic debris actually is not local in Toronto Harbour, but there must be plastic debris coming in from Hamilton and Ajax and Oshawa and Rochester and Niagara Falls, everywhere.
And there is another one that's it's related to what you are saying. How much plastic from Toronto reaches the lake inside the harbour versus outside of the harbour?
Yeah, so specifically the ones that were deployed within Toronto's inner harbour, we saw about a quarter of them leaving the inner harbour. So that means that they either went to the outer harbour, which is still, fairly local, or they just beached along the near Ontario Place through the West Gap. But overall, the ones that actually made significant escapes were just like the escape artists, the 15%, which is still quite a large proportion of our tracker bottles. So our debris really travels far. Oh, I also noticed there was a question about how many bottles did you deploy? So we had 36 bottles, but because of the repeat deployments, we actually ended up deploying like 71 bottles. So that'll give you an idea of the sample size that we had.
And I have another one for Cassie. How long do the batteries last in the trackers, and can they be set to last longer? And what is the maximum time you think they should last?
Great question. So actually, Pat maybe can help me remember, but we had originally set ours to an hour to report each hour of every day. So that every day they were out, and we wanted them to be out for about 4 weeks. So I believe that they predicted to last around 42 days. So that gave us time to still try and retrieve them if we couldn't find them within that 1 month or 4 week period. How long they could potentially last, I believe it's maybe 6 months if you like just keep the batteries. I could be wrong if it only reported say like once a day, but it really depends on how often you want it to program. And then based on that, you can predict with the battery life, how long it would last. Sorry, was there a second part of that question?
Yes, no, yeah, I think you answered yes.
Okay.
And I have more 2 questions first, Chelsea, and then you open for Q&A. Okay, Chelsea, where are plastic come from? Can they come from landfills? And then another question, will the federal government's ban on single-use plastics due to be in place by the end of 2021 make a difference in plastic waste and water quality?
Great question. Yeah, so the plastic that we see comes from lots of different sources. And I would guess that a lot of the kind of single-use plastic items we're seeing in our sea bins are either coming from litter that's directly around the waterfront or coming from upstream, which is either directly littered or blown. Things can blow from landfill, and how good a landfill is how well it's engineered. Sometimes also, as you may notice, when somebody's coming to take the litter from the bin outside your house, sometimes as they're pouring it into the truck, it can escape. And so it does escape before it gets to the landfill. The single-use ban that the government has introduced was actually based off of cleanup data from trash capture devices and also the International Coastal Cleanup or the Great Canadian Shoreline Cleanup data here at home. That data showed the types of single-use items that can be harmful in the environment. And then the government chose items that had a replacement and weren't essential. Do I think it'll make a difference? I do. So I think we need many different solutions turning on all at the same time for this issue of plastic pollution, which is incredibly complex. And I do think it will make a difference. And the way that the government is banning them, so the process has started. First, they declared them toxic under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. That has already been done. That was step 1. And then the next step is to actually enforce the ban, which they say will happen by the end of this year. But declaring them under SEPA gives them the ability to continue to study the types of plastics that could fall under bans to continue to be regulated. So I do think it'll make a difference. And I am optimistic, and we can let you know soon whether we stop seeing that litter on the harbor. And I'll just quickly, before I stop, is that a good example of this is microbeads were banned in 2017 in Canada. We used to see them in our manta trawls sampling surface water in Lake Ontario, and we don't anymore. So all of these little solutions do make a difference, of course, too. What is a larger issue?
Okay, and more 2 questions about technology. Could there ever be a large machine that daily skim the inner harbor to collect trash? I think Boston has one that looks like a cute monster. It is not in Boston. It's a trash wheel. Yes, they have a very little cute faces. And another one is wondering about trash traps. Are they specifically made for not trapping fauna?
You want to take this one, or you want me to take this one?
You want to take Rafa, you kind of covered the trash wheel one, but did you want to add anything, Chelsea, or do you want me to take the fauna one?
I'll just quickly, and then I'll give you the fauna one. So for the Baltimore trash wheel, just for some context, we fell in love with the Baltimore trash wheel, Mr. Trash Wheel. And that was actually the idea that sparked the Uft Trash Team. It's a longer story, but we were trying to get a trash wheel in Toronto that would be the Trash Bandit, and it would be a raccoon, and it was going to sit in the Don River. And with all of the work going on with the Portland's project, the time just wasn't right. But we continue to work with Ports Toronto and TRCA to think about the best types of traps for Toronto. So we are also inspired by Mr. Trash Wheel. And I'll let Cassie, I'll let you answer the question about animals, which is something we think about often.
Yeah, and it definitely is. And actually, if you check out our website in terms of our trapping trash project, within our protocols, we do outline that anyone who has a trash trapping device, they should definitely monitor it every 24 hours when they first deploy it to make sure that it's not catching any fauna. Most of them, I can speak specifically for the Seabin, it is designed so that when it's pulling in surface water, the current is so little that any fauna can swim away. We have seen fish and also heard of sometimes turtles getting in there. We suspect that the fish are probably already, unfortunately, have died, maybe due to water quality conditions and end up in there. Or the turtle, we suspect it actually just wanted to go onto the rim of it to probably bask in the sun, and unfortunately just fell in. But if we suggest that if you see this as a common occurrence, you should definitely revise the location of your trash capture device and maybe pick a place where it's not going to hurt or capture fauna. And if it's a once in a while thing, maybe just make sure that you're monitoring it daily and take out any fauna that might have slipped in. Yeah.
That was amazing. We didn't have anyone raising their hands, and we are now actually at the hour mark, but so if you need to go now, we understand. If you want to stay for a few more minutes, we'll formally wrap up. I actually wanted to ask each of you the same question. And that's just a simple one. It's just to think about, what was something that you weren't expecting that you learned during the whole process of tagging trash that happened. So I don't know who's ready to go first, but maybe I'll start with Chelsea's got the biggest smile, so I'll start with Chelsea. Just something that you
because
weren't.
I wasn't sure.
Go ahead.
The biggest thing I learned, I think, obviously we learned where litter goes, and that was great. But I think we had such a great time getting to know all the community stakeholders, working with the city, working with the BIA, the Business Industry Association, working with TRCA and Ports Toronto, and seeing people ask us questions. Some of our litter, as I think Cassie maybe said, is that some of it went into the garbage can because people wanted to litter and they didn't read the sign, right? So it goes to show you a bit about human behavior and human collaboration, and that part of it was super fun. So I'm really excited to do it again.
Amazing. I'll turn it over to Cassie, since you mentioned her name.
Echoing Chelsea, I think getting to know the community stakeholders was awesome. I know we mentioned obviously our collaborators, but just people along the waterfront in general. Some sailboat groups actually helped us try and retrieve some of the bottles. City of Toronto was really awesome and helping us identify which garbage cans the bottles may be in. But ultimately, I think one of the things was how difficult it might be to retrieve some of these bottles and where they end up within our city infrastructure, under docks, between rocks. It was really crazy. And then once you look in there and you see all the other litter that's present, was really mind-blowing. So that was probably a big lesson there for me.
All right. No pressure, Pat, to wrap it all up. What are some of your
It was just fascinating to see the diversity in the paths of where our tracker bottles went, and also the diversity of plastic, because I was involved in the design and also some of the retrieval process. And so I was able to go out and actually go into some of the channels of Toronto Islands and around Toronto Harbour and just see that there is such a diversity of plastic there. Some poor children had lost their soccer balls and their toys. And, we see parts of boys like buoys. And so just seeing that diversity of plastic, it's not just like single-use plastics, it's all sorts of debris, litter. You can tell some of it is definitely not intentional. So that was really interesting to see for me.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing that. I'll just wrap everything up now just to thank everyone. It's been a pleasure to meet those of you today. Our speakers, we will share their information along with a recording in the email that we'll send to how you registered. If you would like to now Chelsea, Cassie, and Pat, if you want to share your emails in the chat too, if people have other follow-up questions, you can put those there right now. And this is information if you want to stay in touch with our team, have a look on our website. We've been sharing links throughout the entire presentation, and that's how you can find out everything there. We have a newsletter you can sign up for. You can reach out to us by email or follow us on social. And we did record today, so again, that'll be emailed once available, once it's ready. And it'll also be posted to our YouTube channel, which we will put the link to that in the chat, also off of our website as well. And if you want to, relive all of the results that were shared today, Pat and Cassie worked on a blog as well that they finished in the lead up to this webinar that you can find on our website in the blog section. So again, thank you so much for everyone who came out. We hope you have a wonderful rest of the day and that you all stay in touch. Thanks so much.